Thanks for joining us for this podcast from Atlee Church. Atlee is a safe place for those who've given up on church or never went. Our mission is to reach seekers and equip believers to love God, love themselves, love others, and serve the world. We'd love to have you connect with us at one of our physical campuses or online for a weekend service. You can find out more about our locations and service times on our website. We hope that you will be encouraged and challenged to take the next step in your personal faith journey through the message you're about to hear.
In late October of 1991, while working in Boston at the National Hurricane Center, Bob Case described the unusual combination of weather events that were taking place off of the coast of New England and Canada as being perfect for the creation of an incredible, powerful ocean storm that actually would develop. Author Sebastian Junger, who was interviewing Bob Case about the storm, would go on to use the adjective perfect and coin the phrase "the perfect storm" as the title of his book about the storm, as well as the six fishermen who lost their lives during that storm on the Andrea Gale. The title of Junger's book, The Perfect Storm, A True Story of Men Against the Sea, was never meant to be a book to celebrate the storm. Rather, he intended the phrase perfect storm to be read in a meteorological sense to mean a storm that could not possibly have been worse. Storms can be fierce. They can happen without warning. They can be much worse than predicted. And maybe the worst thing of all is how frightful it can be to find yourself in the middle of a storm that you didn't see coming. Such was the case one evening with a group of men who had been following Jesus. They had been with Jesus all day long. Jesus had been teaching on the shore of Galilee, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people had gathered there that day to hear him speak and teach. And this group of men had been with him all day. And maybe it's the end of the day, and because he's tired, Jesus says to the disciples, "Hey, I want to go over to the other side of the lake, maybe to get away from the crowds." Well, whatever the reason, what followed must have had been unforgettable, must have been quite the experience, because both Mark and Luke, both authors of different manuscripts that make up our New Testament, wrote about this event. In fact, here's how Mark records the story. He says, "That day when evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, 'Let us go to the other side.'" Keep going. "Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat." And so here's the scene. Jesus has been teaching all day. In fact, he gets in a boat earlier in the day and pulls out away from the shore so that he could talk to the massive crowds that had gathered there on the beach or the shore where he was at. And so it's evening time. He's tired maybe. And so he's like, "Let's go to the other side." And because he was already in the boat, the disciples decide to join him, and they begin to travel. Now, one of the things that Mark points out is this: at the very end of it, there were also other boats with him. And this is important to note as we go through the rest of this story. Let me give you a little bit of details about the Sea of Galilee just to kind of set this up. The Sea of Galilee is set 696 feet below sea level. Now, if you understand and can picture that, what that does is it sets it up for some violent downdrafts to come from the surrounding shores and the mountains that would have been around this lake. And they would often come, and they would be fierce, and they would come unannounced. They had no way of knowing that these storms were, about to take place. These windstorms are coming, unlike today, where we know often weeks in advance that we may or may not get a storm like today, and we have time to prepare for it. These guys had no time whatsoever, and so this is where they find themselves. So Mark continues and says this: "A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped." So these guys are out there. I imagine it's getting dark, and this storm comes out of nowhere, and these waves just begin to plummet the boat, and literally the boat begins to fill with water. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that, in a literal boat that was taking on water because of wind. I remember being in a very similar situation several years ago. We were fishing down at Lake Gaston. It was me, my dad, my brother, and an uncle. And we crossed the lake early that morning, went up into this creek, and we're fishing these back coves. And while we were up in there, it was beautiful, it was nice, it was calm. And the evening came, and we decided to cross back over to the place that we were staying. And as we came around this point to enter back onto the main lake, the main body of water, we came around the point, and all we could see was white caps. And I mean, there were some monster waves out there. And I remember we stopped and we looked at each other and kind of thought, do we think we can make this? Should we wait it out, see what happens? Well, we decided, as men do, to go ahead and take our chances. And so we fire up the boat and we start out across. And I mean, as soon as we come around that point, the first wave it sounded like somebody was hitting the boat with a hammer, each wave that would hit. And each wave that would hit, I think half of it would come into the boat with us. Three of us moved to the very back of the boat so that we could keep the front of the boat up and hopefully keep it above the waves. As we're going across, the slower our trip became because we took on more and more water, and which added just to the weight of it. And I remember all of us, we were sitting there, and at first it's kind of fun, and then very quickly you realize this is serious, and everybody's kind of hanging on. And I remember at one point looking down behind the seat behind us, and the water was like even with the bench seat that we're on, as well as the back end of the boat. And I remember thinking, this might be the dumbest thing we've ever done. And so all four of us are there, and we get about halfway across, and there's nothing you can do at this point but just keep going. And again, every wave would just pound us, and spray would come over and just continue to fill the boat. These four guys who had earlier in the day been ragging each other and picking on each other about who was catching the most and the biggest and all that, there wasn't a sound to be heard anywhere from any of us as we just held on and hoped for the best. I was the one driving the boat, which I wish I wasn't, because if anything had happened, then it all been on me that day. But I just remember that, and I can only imagine the scene as these guys are in a very similar situation. I would imagine that the storm that they were in was much worse than what we were in. But I can imagine them being there and facing this storm and each wave pounding the boat, and each wave just dumping that much more water in the boat. Mark continues the story, and it says this: Jesus was in the stern sleeping on a cushion. So Mark's telling this story, and he's talking about how this fierce storm comes up, and Jesus, the whole time this is going on, is asleep in the back of the boat. And so don't you hate people like this who could sleep through anything? Anybody know people who can sleep through anything? Yeah, isn't that amazing? I mean, some of you, maybe that's you. You could, there could be this huge earthquake. The house could be burning down, and you would sleep right through it. You wake up and somebody's telling you what happened. And you're like, no way, that didn't happen. I hate people who can do that, who can sleep through anything. Well, that's kind of what I envision here. Maybe he's just so worn out that he just, that's all he could do was sleep. But these disciples, they're paddling for their lives. I imagine the ones who aren't paddling, they're bailing water as fast as they can, and maybe they look and they realize, hey, wait a minute, this dude's not even aware of what's going on, and so they're going to wake him up, and for good reason, maybe because they need help. Maybe because it's like, this is a time for all hands on deck, or maybe they realize that, hey, if we don't get some help, the end for him as well of us isn't going to be very good. And so they decide to wake up Jesus, and Mark continues with the story and said, disciples woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Let me ask you something. Have you ever been there? Have you ever found yourself in the perfect storm and asking a very similar question? Don't you care, God? Aren't you even aware of what's going on around me? Are you asleep? Are you, distracted? Do you not know what's going on? 2018 has been filled with numerous storms. Wildfires, earthquakes, now snowstorms, We've had snowquakes. I mean, we've had just about any kind of storm that you can imagine has happened this year. Billions of dollars worth of property has been destroyed. Countless many lives have been lost. Some still have not been found. But weather-related storms are not the only storms and catastrophes that people have faced this year. In fact, many people have faced storms much worse than those. People have faced health storms. Their health has deteriorated to a point that requires serious medical attention. Others have faced financial storms, relational storms. And one of the biggest storms that I see that people face this time of year is what I will call the storm of loneliness. Already I'm having conversations with people, how's Christmas? And they're like, it used to be a great time of the year for me, but anymore it's like the worst time of the year because it just reminds me of how lonely I am. And people find themselves, thinking about and being reminded of what they don't have or maybe who they don't have in their lives. People have lost their physical ability to do what they were once able to do, and it's hard to face that new reality. People lost jobs, lost homes, lost property, lost loved ones. Some have weathered the storm. As December comes around, as Christmas comes around, maybe for you, your storm happened earlier in the year and you're on the backside of that storm, but for many folks this time of the year, you find yourself right in the middle of one of those such storms right now. The time of year when it's supposed to be the most wonderful time of all is just the opposite for some folks. Again, because they're reminded of what they don't have and maybe who they don't have in their life. Instead of enjoying the holidays, some are finding themselves questioning God and saying to God, just like the disciples, "Teacher, don't you care? Don't you care, God, what's going on in my life right now? Don't you care if we drown? Don't you care if I don't make it through this? God, are you even aware of what's going on in my life right now?" Many of us have found ourselves in that situation before. Facing a storm that maybe came out of nowhere. Maybe you knew it was coming, but it ended up being much worse than you thought. And again, I'm not talking about physical storms, but physical storms may have brought on these emotional storms and spiritual storms that exist in our lives. But many of us have found ourselves there and we've questioned God. God, do you even care? I want to say this morning as we begin this new series and this Christmas series. I can't promise you when your storm's going to end. I can't promise you how your storm is going to end. But the one thing that I can promise you, as you're going to see today, is that no matter what storm you find yourself in, God is with you in the middle of that storm. God is with you. And if you will let this storm and every storm that you face, because for many of you it's probably not your first storm, and for all of us it won't be the last. But if we will let these storms do it, these storms can teach us something about God that we can't experience and be revealed about God unless we walk through, unless we weather these storms. This is what Peter would learn that day. This would be I think the first of many lessons that he would learn as he would face storms in his life. You see, Peter is the one who actually passed this whole story on to Mark. Mark was a historian. Mark wrote about the events, and most of it, and really all of his information came from Peter. Peter was the one who was the eyewitness. Peter was the one who lived through this, and he was telling Mark about these stories. And I just imagine as Peter is telling Mark this day about this, and Mark's trying to write it down maybe as fast as he can, but I can imagine the excitement in his voice as Peter remembers this day and he tells the story. He's like, "Mark, man, you just had to be there. We were goners. We didn't see any way out." I mean, Peter was a fisherman. He'd been on the water, grew up on the water probably all of his life and had experienced storms like this. But Mark, there was something different about this storm, Mark, and it was nothing like anything I'd ever experienced before. And we're all holding on to for our lives. And if we weren't paddling, we were bailing water and just trying to keep the boat pointed in the right direction. And then as we're doing all of this, Mark, you won't believe what we realized. We turned around, and Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat. And we're like, dude, man, we need all hands on deck. And we woke him up and we're like, Jesus, you got to help us. Don't you even care what we're going through? Don't you care what happens? But he says, Mark, that isn't even the big part of the story that I want you to get. He says, Mark, it was what happened next, what happened after we woke Jesus up. That was incredible. Mark continues the story. He says, he got up referring to Jesus. And the first thing that Jesus did was he rebuked the wind and he said to the waves, quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. Everybody say completely calm. I can just imagine as Peter's telling this and he's like, Mark, the storm was bad and like it was one thing that he was asleep, but when we woke him up and Jesus stood up and the first thing that he did was he yells at this storm and he says, quiet, be still, and immediately everything just went calm. The waves died down, the wind stopped. There's nothing more peaceful than those few moments after a storm passes, is there? Those moments when the wind does die down, the waves stop beating the boat, the wind quits blowing, the snow, and it's just that peace, that quiet for that moment. Peter didn't end the recount of the story there. Here's how he said the storm really ended. Then he said to his disciples, Jesus, he says, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? So Peter said it didn't end there. He didn't end with him just calming the storms. And he says, listen, you got to remember this. We weren't the only ones out there. I wasn't the only one in the boat. We weren't the only boat out there. They all saw this. They all saw this go down. And Jesus rebukes them and the storm, and then he turns to us and he says, why are you so afraid? He said, and then it says they were terrified and asked each other, who is this? See, here's what Peter and those guys would begin to learn that day, just who this guy really was. He says, who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him? At this point, they have no idea who Jesus really is. They've never experienced this kind of a moment with him. And so, they've heard his teachings. They've been mesmerized by the things that he taught them, the things that he knew, and just the way he could tell stories, and they were fascinated with it, and they're learning all this new stuff. But today they learned something that not just, that terrified them. So as I read this story, I find it's interesting. They go from being afraid of the storm to being terrified to know who this man is, that even the wind, even the storms obey what he has to say. See, Peter would begin to learn a valuable lesson that day. You see, this would be the first of many storms that Peter would face in his life. And each storm that he would face, he would learn something new about God and about Jesus that was true for his life. You see, on another trip across this same body of water, one night in the middle of the night, again, they find themselves caught in the middle of the storm, and they're rowing for all their lives. They're hanging on. They're doing their best to keep the boat pointed into the waves and into the wind. And as they're paddling for their lives, one of the guys in the boat looks and they see this person, this figure walking across the water. And again, they find themselves terrified, and Jesus speaks to him, hey, don't be afraid, it's me. And Peter, being the brave guy that he is, always putting his foot in his mouth, is like, Jesus, if that's really you, then let me come out on the water and walk with you. And Jesus says, then get out of the boat and come on. Now, I don't know about you, but the last thing I would have done would have taken that step. But Peter did. And if you know the story, in the middle of this storm, Peter is walking on water. And I can't begin to imagine it. I'm just telling you, Peter is the one who's telling this story. Others were there. They saw it. If it wasn't true, I don't think it would have made our Bible. We wouldn't be talking about it today, but it happened. So here's Peter in the middle of this storm, and he's walking toward Jesus, but all of a sudden, Peter does what many of us often do when we find ourselves in the middle of the storm. Instead of looking to God, we begin to look at the storm, and the longer that we're in the storm, the quicker that we are to take our eyes off Jesus and put it on the storm. And what happens when Peter begins to look at the storm? He begins to sink, doesn't he? And he cries out to Jesus, and then Jesus again grabs him by the hand, pulls him out of the water, and places him in the boat. But isn't that what we do sometimes? In the middle of the storm, instead of focusing on who God is and focusing on him, we begin to focus ourselves on the storm. And we begin to cry out just like Peter, don't you care that I'm about to drown? I think this was twice that Peter would have said that, at least twice. But that storm wouldn't compare to the emotional and spiritual storm that Peter would face. I think they prepared him for this. But the storm that happened the night that Jesus was arrested and beaten and eventually crucified, on this night, Peter once again will lose all hope as he would look at the storm that was taking place around him. The story tells us, and Jesus warned Peter that this was going to happen, that Peter, before the rooster crows tonight, you're going to deny me 3 times. And sure enough, as the story unfolds, Jesus being beaten, Peter's hiding in the crowd, and somebody recognizes him. Hey, dude, weren't you a part of that following? Weren't you, a friend of his? And 3 different times he would be asked, and 3 different times he would deny that he even knew who Jesus was. And on the 3rd time, him and Jesus would make eye contact with each other. Jesus would go on to be crucified, and that would be his last moments with Jesus. And so, as the story unfolds, Jesus is beaten, he's buried in a grave, and he comes back to life, and he finds Peter, of all places, back on the shore, back on the water of the same place where he'd faced all of these other storms. And on that same shore, he would restore Peter and his faith. If you know the story, Jesus says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, God, you know that I do. And 3 different times this conversation would take place, and Jesus would ask him, not because Jesus needed to know, but he needed Peter to know that Peter still loved Jesus. Peter needed to be, he'd blown it. He'd taken his eyes off of Jesus in the middle of the storm, but God was right there with him. And on that same shoreline, he would restore Peter in his faith. He would learn to trust firsthand what I think him being a Jewish man would have known, and that he would have been very familiar with the Jewish Bible, the Jewish scriptures, and especially the Psalms. And so I think that day, that evening, that he would be reminded and firsthand begin to accept this as being true for his own life. Something that King David wrote in Psalms 46 that says this. David says, God is our refuge. Everybody say refuge. And our strength. Everybody say strength. God is our refuge and our strength, an ever-present help in trouble. I believe that night on, Peter never forgot that. And he began to live by this. Because this same man who was afraid for his life would go on to give his life to never be afraid again, to stand up for Jesus Christ because of what he learned about God through these different storms in his life. That God really is a refuge, a safe place, a haven to weather the storm, not to escape the storm, but a place that he could turn to and run to and find shelter and find what did he need, the strength to get through that storm. He would learn that he is an ever-present help in trouble, that no matter what he was going through, he would be there. David would go on to say, therefore we will not fear. And again, I don't think from that moment on, Peter ever feared his relationship with God, because he would go on to become one of the greatest followers of Christ. He would be a martyr for the cause of Christ. The very thing that he was afraid of, now he was willing to die for, and ultimately did give his life for, because of what he had experienced in his own life. Therefore, we will not fear. What is it? Though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. David had experienced something. I don't think he's talking about just physical storms, even though they very well could have been. And I know a lot of folks who, when physical storms really happen, that they're just as terrifying for them as emotional storms. But I think the storms that David's talking about is the everyday storms that we all face, that no matter what happens around us, I will not fear, because God is my refuge and God is my strength. So maybe this season is supposed to be the most wonderful time of all, most wonderful time of the year, because of what this season reminds us of the most. Again, I can't promise you when your storm's going to end. I can't promise you how your storm's going to end, but I can promise you this, as Peter learned, that God is with you no matter what. And may this Christmas story remind us of that this year. Let me just read this to you. This is the Christmas story according to Matthew. This is how the birth of Jesus the Messiah came about. His mother Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph, and before they came together, she was found to be pregnant through the Holy Spirit. Now, when you think of storms, I want you to just think about this storm for Joseph, because this would have been a storm in his life. He's pledged to be married to this woman who then finds herself pregnant before they get married. So just imagine Joseph. Because Joseph, her husband, was faithful to the law and yet did not want to expose her to public disgrace, he had in mind to divorce her quietly. But after he had considered this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary home as your wife, because what is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." And all of this took place to fulfill, or all of this took place maybe to remind us this season of what the Lord had said through the prophet when he said, "The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they," everybody say they, "and they will call him Emmanuel." Can we all say to Emmanuel together? Emmanuel. One more time. Emmanuel. And again. And they will call him Emmanuel, which means what? God with us. Emmanuel, God with us. This Christmas season, may you be reminded that no matter what you're going through, and I hope for you that life is calm, life is quiet, but I know for many of you it's not. We've had conversations. I know what's going on. For many of you, it's not calm. You're in the heart of this storm. And so I just pray that we can be reminded that no matter what we're going through, no matter how bad the storm may be, no matter how tall the waves may be, how hard the wind may be blowing, God is with you. God is with you. And I'll leave you with this thought. Never let the presence of a storm cause you to doubt the presence of God. Never let the presence of a storm in your life cause you to doubt the presence of God.
We hope this message will help you continue to explore, experience, and express God's grace and truth for your life. If Atlee Church is making a difference in your life, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions from this message, we'd love to talk to you. Email us at stories@atleechurch.org. Check out our website for more about our community, our ministries, and how you can financially support Atlee Church to help us continue to share messages like this one. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. We have links on our website, or you can search for us on iTunes to get this podcast every week. Thanks again, and hope to see you next Sunday.